Hi, I'm FIDE Master Levi Cherbulenko, and in this series I analyze the openings of people rated anywhere between 8,000 and 2,000. The following is a chess.com game played between 721 versus 1235. Let's start. Alright, so e4, c5, okay, so the Sicilian defense. Knight f3 developing the knight. Knight to c6 developing the knight is not the main move. Other two moves would be like d6, e6, there's also g6, right? But let's see, knight c6. Pawn to c3. Okay, interesting. Again, this is not the main move. I don't think it's the best move either. I mean, the main move would be d4. That's like the most common move, right? Fighting for the center. That's like the most typical move in the Sicilian. White always goes d4, right? cd, knight takes d4, and now black has various variations. They can either play, g6, and then bishop g7, forming a dragon setup, or they can play d6, or they can play knight f6, develop the second knight, put pressure on this pawn. They can eventually then play with e5, right? Or they can play with e6. So there's many variations, really. So the downside of this, so why don't I recommend d4 usually? Because there's so much theory, for a low-rated player, it's like quite difficult to know all this stuff, to remember all this stuff. So it's not really practical, especially for a low-rated player. What I like to play myself, I like to play bishop b5. This is called the Rossolimo variation. The biggest plus of this is you avoid all this crazy nonsense, all this theory, right? And it's just normal chess. You just play normal positions. You don't need to remember much theory. It's just you get a normal position. Now, what is the point? The goal is to take the knight. Yes, you give up the bishop. The bishops are usually stronger, but in return, you damage black structure. They'll take dc or bc. Either way, they'll have double pawns. And so this is the strategy. Yes, we give up the bishop, but we take the knight. We damage their structure, so we'll have double pawns. Double pawns, they're basically like one pawn, right? Just like one pawn, basically. And then your goal would be to keep the game closed, because you have the two knights, and he has the two bishops. So bishops are stronger in open positions. So black's goal would be to open the game up, and then that would be his compensation for his double pawns, right? Yes, he has double pawns, which is a weakness, but if he can open the game up, then it would compensate, right, with his two bishops, those two pawns. And vice versa, if you can keep the game close, then you will have an advantage, because the knights are stronger than bishops in close positions, because the knights can jump over pawns, right? And then we have double pawns and no compensation. So that's the point, right? So there's many moves here. Black can play, let's say, maybe like g6 or something, and you just take the knight. Let's say we go dc, you play d3. You do not want to play c3, d4 or something, because then you help him undouble the pawn and open the game up. So you want to, vice versa, you want to fix the weakness. We play d3 to fix the weakness, and we want to keep this sturdy pawn chain, right? We want to keep it fixed. Fixed chain, not like a very mobile chain, not c3, d4. We do not want to have a mobile pawn chain. We don't want to open up a center. We want to keep it more fixed, right? Let's say bishop g7. You could play, let's say, pawn h3 to prevent any bishop g4 stuff. Let's say he goes knight f6. You can go knight c3. Then you can go bishop e3, attacking this e3, this c5 pawn, weak pawn, queen d2 one, and then maybe like bishop h6, and with good play for white. Okay, so something like this. But c3, what is the goal of c3? The goal of c3 is to play d4, but when black takes on d4, white wants to take back with a pawn. A pawn center is better than a piece center. A pawn center is better than a piece, because the piece, like if you get a knight on d4, imagine the knight on d4, I mean, is not a real attacking as the knight on c6, because these are pieces of the same value, and so the knight doesn't really control anything. Whereas if you get a pawn on d4, the pawn can push forward to d5, attack the knight, make his pieces go backward. It controls c5, it controls e5. So these pawns, the d4, e4, which is called the small center, they really control lots of squares, and you can eventually advance them and make your opponent's pieces go back, and thus gaining space, right, and initiative. That's why ideally you want to have a pawn center, not a piece center. Okay, so let's see what black played. g6. Okay, that is okay. That is fine. What else? So what else can black play in this kind of positions? So another rule of thumb is this. So I told you that white normally plays like d4 is like the main move, right? So there's a rule of thumb. When your opponent does not play actively with pawns in the center, when he should, right? He normally plays d4, but here he does not play d4. So when your opponent refrains from playing actively in the center, you should do that. You should play actively in the center. So white play the slow move c3. So when black can play d5, see, typically in the Sicilian, black doesn't play d5. They usually play like d6, correct? Not really d5. Because usually white is the one to play, you know, d4. And so then d5 doesn't work. But if your opponent refrains from playing actively in the center, then we can play actively in the center, and then we can play d5. And then what's the point? Well, the point is that if white takes, then we take with the queen, we activate the queen, and now at some point white will have to push this pawn, because I mean it's blocking the queen, blocking the bishop, blocking the knight, right? So we have to push a pawn, and basically now or later or now, let's say now for example, yeah, black will take, white will take, and white will end up with an isolated pawn. And so it's not like it's not like white's worse here or anything, but it is a strategical weakness, right? And like white needs to be very precise how he plays, otherwise he'll end up in a worse position, right? Because an isolated pawn is a strategical weakness itself. And also very key, the square right in front of it, which in this case is the d5 square, also very weak when you have an isolani, because then eventually black will play knight f6, knight d5, and when we put the knight on d5, white can never attack that knight with the e or c pawn, because they have none. Okay, so d5 is very common when we play c3, because again you end up with an isolated pawn structure, and it's okay for black if he plays precisely. Okay, or if black also might take later, you know, if not now. Okay, so this is one way black will play. And if white plays e5, I mean, not really ideal one. I mean, black can just develop a bishop, right, and then play e6, or develop a bishop to g4, pin the knight, and now this pawn is weak, right? This pawn, let's say like bishop g4, threatening knight e5, or bishop takes f3 first and then knight e5, and then let's say white goes d4, and then black would take, and maybe play like queen b6, right, threatening to take on f3, and then take the pawn on d4, so d4 is a really weak pawn. White can't really play bishop e3, because then we lose a pawn on b2. See, so d4 is a very weak pawn for black, for white, I'm sorry. And then black can also play next e6, knight h6 or knight e7, either way, and then go through f5. From h6 or from e7, go through f5 and put even more pressure on the d4 pawn. So this is absolutely great for black. So that's like one way, or there's also another idea. Sometimes in these kind of positions, if we want to prevent d4 from white, although we saw that d4 pawn might actually become a weakness for white, so maybe we don't need to do it. But let's say if we don't want to prevent, there's even this idea of d4 sometimes. And so we dislodge, right, this pawn structure. We dislodge the e5 pawn from the d2 pawn, right? Let's say takes, and now this pawn, they might just lose it potentially, because white cannot play d4, you know. So there's that as well. But a lot of times you don't even need that. You just play bishop f5 or bishop g4 like I've shown you, and the d4 pawn will actually be a weakness for white. Okay, so d5 would be one way. Black played g6, which is also a pretty good move. There's also, this is the second strategy. So one strategy, you don't allow white to create this two-pawn center, right? You play d5 yourself, and so they don't have, when we play d4, they don't have a two-pawn center. They have an isolated pawn. That's one way. You simply do not allow the center. There's also another way. This is basically modern chess. You allow your opponent to make the center, to create a center, but then you attack it from the flanks, from the sides, right? And so then, if you give him the center but don't do anything about it, a pawn center is an asset. But if you put pressure on it from the flanks, it could become a liability for white. It could become a liability. So the point would be that black allows white to play d4, cd, but then black plays bishop to g7, right? And puts, so for example, let's say d4 takes bishop g7 and puts pressure on this pawn. And if white is not careful, potentially it might become a weakness. Black could play like queen b6, potentially, you know, might become a weakness. Also, there's ideas like d6 and bishop g4. Remember this key idea. Whenever you have a fianchettoed bishop, knight on c6, fianchettoed bishop, pressure on d4, you want to remove the f3 knight. The f3 knight is the cornerstone for white, because it guards this key d4 pawn. You do not need this bishop. This bishop is not attacking d4, is not attacking, so you do not need it again. You want to play like this, bishop g4, take the knight, right? And then put pressure on d4, you know. So this is, yeah, it's pretty, but again, if white plays precisely, he probably maybe can hold the pawn, He can play like h3, for example, to prevent bishop g4, but still white needs to be precise. So again, it's not like white is or much better or much worse or anything. It all depends. This is all flexible, right? There's pluses, there's downsides. There's pressure on the d4 pawn, but maybe if white plays precisely, maybe he can hold, but if he plays imprecisely, he might not hold it, you know? So it's just knowing like this intricacies, but it's not like black and white. Oh, white is worse, white is much better, right? It's just knowing these intricacies. So yeah, but okay, let's see what happened in the game. d4, okay, white did play d4, cd, knight takes d4. I'm not so sure about that. I mean, then why do you play c3? I mean, why do you then play c3 if you're gonna take over knight? It looks too slow. There is an upside. White avoids this like two-pawn center, and now they don't have a potential maybe liability to defend. You know, so it's like it looks easier because like if you don't have a pawn on d4, there's nothing to defend, so it's easier to play on one hand. On the other hand, easier is not always better. Yeah, you can play easier moves, but you don't have any advantage. Think about it. So if we talk in general, you can play easy moves, right? Not commit to anything, but then you will win a lot less games, right? Because you play easy moves, but also no advantage. So the goal is not to play easy moves. The goal is to find good moves and be able to calculate them and be able to sustain them, you know, and continue playing the good moves. Right? That is the goal, not to play knight d4, oh, easy position, but also no advantage. No, you have to learn, okay, play cd, this is more difficult to hold, but this will lead to advantage. So if your goal is to improve long term, you have to learn to play the good moves and be able to play more complicated positions, but that give you an advantage. That is the goal, not to avoid, or just because it's complicated, but then you're never going to get good positions, you know? So that's why I think the most principal line would have been to play cd. Otherwise, there's no point that you played c3. Okay? Just be careful. Play h3. Don't allow, you know, bishop g4. Stuff like that. Yeah. So knight d4, usually, again, it's better to have a pawn center. Yes, you have to be careful, but if you're careful, it's okay. So it's better to have a pawn center than a piece center. You don't really have any advantage. Okay? So knight d4, I don't really like. Now white has zero advantage. Knight c6, what is this? No, this I don't like. This is a mistake. Another rule of thumb, in the Sicilian defense, we do not take on c6 because one, you just release the tension. You just simplify, release the tension, and the more you release the tension, the more you simplify, the more difficult to win. Two, you allow black to play bc, and now this is not good for us. Why? For a couple of reasons. One, it opens up the b file, which in conjunction with the bishop on g7 potentially puts pressure on our b2 pawn. So this is not good. You open up the b file for their rook. This is a very bad thing. Another thing is now they control this d5 square. So for example, what do I mean? Here, black doesn't really control the d5 square. Potentially you can put a piece there, a knight there, you can put maybe eventually somehow, right? And black can't really defend that square so easily with e6. Why? Because if they play e6, then they put too many pawns on the same color, and then they weaken the opposite color. So that would be d6. So if they play e6, you'd have like knight b5, knight d4, knight d6, for example, yeah? If you play e6. Plus the bishop would be absolutely stuck, the light square bishop, right? So it's not a good idea. Plus the d7 pawn would become backward, so then you can put pressure on the d file, you know what I mean? So they cannot really defend that square, the d5 square, with a pawn. And so you can eventually put a piece there. But if you play like this, then they control the key d5 square. And the last thing, it gives black more mobility, more dynamics, meaning they can make a pawn break potentially with d5 and strike us in the center. It gives them the possibility to play e6, d5 at some point, right? And make a pawn break in the center, which is not good. You should not give your opponent these kind of opportunities to make pawn breaks in the center. So it's not a good move. I think much more logical would be to, so they put pressure on our knight, right? Okay, just defend it, bishop e3. Just defend it. And then develop a bishop here, depending on the situation, here or here, to pressure here, castle, you know, develop the knight, and something like that, and white is fine, you know. Or develop the knight here, and then here, and maybe put the queen on d2, and then like bishop h6 eventually, you know. Something like that. So bishop e3, you keep the tension. You keep the tension, yeah, but no, Knight c6 is not good. Knight c6 is a mistake. Okay, bc. So never take on c6 in the Sicilian. Okay, bishop d3. Okay, knight f6, castles, castles. f4, okay. f4, d6. Defending against e5, opening up the bishop. All right. h3. I mean, it looks kind of slow, but it might be potentially useful because sometimes there's like knight g4 ideas, queen b6 check, and then king goes away, and the knight f2. Also, if we want to put the bishop on e3, there's like knight g4 annoying, right? So HP actually might be useful. Yeah. Okay, bishop d7, connecting the heavy pieces, developing a little bit of a bishop, guarding the potentially weak c6 pawn. Okay, it does make some sense. There's also another idea. Another idea is that when you have a thinking bishop, most of the time we do not keep the knight on f6. We almost never keep the knight on f6 because, I mean, first of all, it doesn't do much here on f6. The e4 pawn is guarded, but most importantly, it blocks the bishop. It blocks the bishop. We need to open it up. But also, like I said, the knight itself is not doing much. So another typical idea for black would be to play knight to d7. This opens up the bishop, and then the knight could go to c5 and put pressure on the d3 bishop, on the e4 pawn, right? And it's just a much more active square, the c5 square, right? And then maybe play rook b8, and then, for example, if white plays bishop to c2 after knight c5, black could play bishop a6 and activate the bishop that way, you know? So c5 is a pretty typical square for a knight in these kind of positions, yeah. But okay, bishop d7. Queen f3, I guess that's okay. I mean, bishop e3, I think, would be maybe more logical, right? Bishop e3 to protect this square, right? Against this check and stuff. And then knight d2. Knight d2, maybe then put the queen on f3 or e2, already depends. Bring the rook, depending on the situation, or d1 or e1. And then maybe try to push for e5. Why not, right? Something like that, maybe. There's also, I mean, another idea potentially. White could play. Another idea would be to play, you know, to basically play like this. This, bring the knight to f3. Play queen e1. Bring the queen all the way to h4. Then play pawn to f5. Then bring the bishop from c1 to h6. And then play knight g5. And then we are basically threatening checkmate, right? We're basically threatening to take the bishop on g7. King takes g7. Take on g6, they take some way, and then we take rook takes f6, sacrifice the rook, they take some way, and then queen h7, checkmate. So that is also a typical idea for white, right? To attack on the king side like that. Queen e1, queen h4, pawn f5, bishop h6, knight g5. When we take on g6, sack the rook on f6, and checkmate on h7, okay? But okay, here... Okay, this is, I think, a conceptual mistake. In the Sicilian, usually Sicilian endgames are good for black. Are good for black. In general, in most openings, it's good for black to trade because white has a first move. Usually, white has some initiative. So to wear it off, we usually want to trade the queens as black. So, and in the Sicilian especially, why? Because black has an open or semi-open file on the queen side. That's why Sicilian endgames are good for black because okay, here is the B file, but a lot of times in the Sicilian, like if you think about the first moves, e4, c5, knight f3, d6. d4, cd, knight takes d4. Black has the semi-open c file. Or semi-open c file. That's why black usually has an advantage in the endgames, because of a semi-open c file. Here is a semi-open b file. Either way, it's an advantage for black. White's only chance is to create some complications on the king side in the center, to keep the queens, to keep it more messy. Without the queens, it's more difficult to create like some tactic and stuff, and already the strategical aspect is more important. So the b file, you know. So that's why you should not trade the queens, because black has no problems in the endgame. They have a semi-open b file. They have a mobile pawn center, you know. So white definitely shouldn't have traded. White should have played king h1. And then maybe attack this queen with a knight, yeah, maybe something like this. And then develop this bishop, something like that. So do not trade the queens as white in the Sicilian. Queen f2. Okay, queen, I mean, of course, should have just taken. Just taken here and just go like, I don't know, this rook to b8 or this rook to b8, maybe push the pawn, you know, to gain space, something like that. This knight potentially we want to activate, maybe play bishop b6, right? Putting pressure here, and then activate the knight like this, maybe. Just gotta be careful about f5, not to lose a bishop, yeah? But something like this, something like this. Yeah, queen a5, I don't know. Okay, b4, Yeah, b4 is weakening. b4, let's see, b4. Yeah, no, okay, no, this already, we go already in the middle game, basically. So it's just weakening. We don't need b4. It's weakening this diagonal. Why would white play b4? No, basically, I'm just gonna say white, I think, should play knight d2 without weakening any pawn structure, and then go knight c4. Attack the queen, right? The queen goes, and then develop this bishop to like e3 or d2 or something. Bring the rook maybe to h2, e1, and then go for maybe like e5, something like that, you know. Or it depends on the situation. Sometimes maybe f5 also, yeah. But something like this. White should have kept his pawn structure intact and not play b4 and weaken his long diagonal. Yeah, I think black, and then it's like a complicated, maybe like around, I'd say dynamic equality. Nothing crazy for either side, but like dynamic equality. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.